Author Donna Jodhan presents The Boardroom Brawl. No one was surprised to learn later that the boardroom meeting had turned into a brawl. One for all and all for one, so to speak. Most people, however, were quite surprised that the event had turned into a crime. Tensions had been high before the meeting, with board members accusing each other of various white-collar crimes and misdeeds. Then someone went just a bit too far in their accusations. Things quickly got out of hand. The chairman could not control the resulting events. An attempted cover-up made matters even worse. Now it was too late to prevent the police from intervening.
Hello there, it's Detective DJ, and welcome to one of our shows. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for having tuned in to listen to our shows, whether you've bought our shows, whether you have subscribed to them, whether you're listening to them on ACB Radio. I want to thank each and every one of you for listening in. Well, do we have a very, very interesting murder mystery for you? And I know that you have already heard the description. And now you're just waiting to dive right into it to see what happens. Who's accused? Who is convicted? Who do the jury think did it? Who do the prosecution thinks did it? Well, before we get into the boardroom brawl, I'd just like to introduce my team to you one more time. We have Dr. Shay Harrington, who is our resident psychologist, Chip Sanderson, who is our resident investigator and my right-hand person. We have Dr. Ryan Martini, our crime scene specialist, Dr. Nicholas Gasquet, and Dr. Nicholas does all our pathology stuff for us. We have Alex Kirchhoff, our whiz kid, who's always on hand to ask these very, very important questions. And of course, me, Detective DJ. So, let's sit back and enjoy another murder mystery for today. The Boardroom Brawl. Well, moments before the crime, I'll tell you what it's like. It's a typical winter's afternoon in the downtown core, and workers are pouring out of large office towers as they seek to find their way home. Yeah, it's a busy afternoon, a typical afternoon, and many of them are bundled up against the biting winds. Boy, is it ever cold. Some are carrying overstuffed briefcases, and others are loaded down with parcels. Yeah, your typical afternoon. Cars are honking their horns as pedestrians hustle to beat the lights. Typical. The lights in the store windows are twinkling, and bars and restaurants are already beginning to fill up. Christmas decorations are up almost everywhere. Yeah, it's a festive time of the year. And store windows are displaying all kinds of everything, from toys and electronics to fancy clothes for everyone. Santa Claus can be heard laughing. Ho, ho, ho is what he's doing, and it's a rich, echoing laugh across the streets and bouncing off the buildings. A middle-aged man is just one of those walking along the sidewalk with his hands buried deep in his pockets. A young lady is about ready to enter a hotel, and she seems very intent on the business at hand, while two young men in business suits are loitering amiably outside of a large conference room. And this they're doing on the 4th floor of an office tower. This is a scene moments before this particular crime takes place. So, Now we go to the scene of the crime. The boardroom of a prestigious banking institution is now a crime scene. Moments ago, 2 people had been shot point-blank range after a brawl had broken out. Mayhem was everywhere. The room was littered with papers and laptops, cups, saucers, and plates. Someone seemed to have been giving a presentation moments before the crime took place. A chart depicting groups of figures was still being displayed on the electronic screen at the front of the room. Plates of cookies and fruit were still stacked on side tables, along with tea and coffee pots and mugs and cups. Someone had called the police. 2 people were dead, and they were both lying not too far from each other at the front of the room. Well, according to Dr. Shea Harrington, she tells us that the perfect location for this crime was the boardroom, and it was at a company's board meeting that this crime took place. And the perfect occasion, according to Dr. Shea, when all of the major executives would be there. And the victim's reason for having been there, according to Dr. Shea, they were there to attend the meeting. So this is what we've come up with so far: a crime scene and Dr. Shea's words of wisdom. Now let's go on to see what happens next. And according to Chip, the motives for this crime is as follows. He thinks that someone may have wanted a cover-up, and they wanted the cover-up to remain a secret. Someone may have uncovered something, and they had to be silenced. And someone may have threatened to go public, and that person had to be silenced. These are the motives according to our Chip. Now, let's look at the profile of the suspect. According to Dr. Shea once more, the suspect or suspects wanted or probably wanted a deep, dark secret to be kept. And they wanted it to be kept very quiet. Because if it were to be revealed, it would cause irreparable damage to them. The killer would have everything to lose if their secret were to be revealed. They were desperate and reckless. Desperate times called for desperate measures. So, according to our investigation, and again, we had our Chip do most of this investigation, the Royal Imperial Bank had recently been in the news, and for very good reason. Millions of dollars had gone missing over the past 5 years, and it appeared that bad investments had been made by the bank. This was the first impression, but it was soon discovered that embezzlement had also been involved. One very high official had recently resigned and had disappeared. Another had died of a sudden heart attack, and now the rest of the board was under investigation. Statements of personal and business accounts of every board member had been seized. Statements of assets and liabilities had also been seized. And some of the board members were highly enraged, while others were confused. A few were scared, and 1 or 2 were ready to quit. One particular board member had managed to transfer most of his personal funds to an offshore account, and another had managed to transfer most of his assets to the names of his 2 adult kids, and a third had been caught selling off some of their personal assets in order to pay off creditors, while the fourth had been discovered being investigated by the RIS. An emergency board meeting had been called for this particular day. Robin Benson and Amanda Stokes were the 2 investigators who had been hired for this project. They had spent much time as follows: examining financial statements of the bank, financial statements of each board member, emails sent and received by each board member, and list of cell phone calls and text messages of each board member. The 2 investigators had been invited to present their findings at the board meeting on this day. First, the investigators produced relevant lists of emails sent and received by various board members. But they did not disclose at this time who sent and who received these emails. Next, they did the same with the cell phone calls and the text messages. Then they began to put up chart after chart of figures gleaned from various financial statements on the electronic screen at the front of the room. It is at this time that the accusations started to fly. Then things started to get out of hand. The chairman tried in vain to restore order, but was not very successful. A brawl ensued quickly, and it lasted for a few minutes. Then someone had suggested that a cover-up be attempted. This was not well received, and after a few minutes, shots were fired. Then the 2 investigators were dead. Wow. Well, according to our Chip, here are the suspects that he has identified. Stan Cutler, a millionaire with rapidly expanding business empires in the Far East. David Madison, a wealthy banker with banking contacts in Europe. And Sheldon Haskins, a wealthy guru and mogul in lots of financial difficulty. Reed Harrison, in the midst of a multi-million-dollar divorce. Wow. 4 suspects, all identified by our Chip. Now, according to Dr. Nicky Gasquet, he says the cause of death was as follows. He says that both victims had been shot at point-blank range. Robin Benson had been shot in the forehead, and Amanda Stokes had been shot in the heart, and both had died instantly. We're thinking, how could this have been done? And according to Dr. Nicholas Gasquet, he's saying, or he has a theory as to how this was done. Robin Benson may have been shot first, as he stood at the lectern making his presentation. Amanda Stokes was sitting off to the side of the lectern at a table loaded with papers, and there was also a laptop at this table. Amanda may have tried to rise when Robin was shot, but the killer had shot her as she had done so. She had fallen backwards over her chair, and somehow the killer had managed to exit the room during the mayhem, and had tossed a gun with a gloved hand from the 4th floor down onto the main floor. So let's just summarize for you what we have so far. We have a crime scene where 2 people have been murdered. We know that these 2 people are 2 investigators that have been brought in by the Royal Imperial Bank to investigate wrongdoings that have been going on at the bank during the last while. They have been shot at point-blank range, and now they lie dead at the front of the room. Robin Benson has been shot in the forehead, and Amanda Stokes has been shot in the heart. It appears that Robin was shot first, and when he was shot, Amanda Stokes rose from her position or her seat at a table that was loaded with papers and a laptop, and the killer had shot her in the heart. This board meeting was being held on this day to hear what the investigators had turned up after having examined emails and texts from cell phone calls for each board member. Brawl had broken out, mayhem was everywhere in the boardroom, and then the shots were fired. The profile of the suspect, as we think it to be, is as follows. The suspect probably wanted a deep, dark secret to be kept hidden. He didn't want anyone to know about the secret, because if it were to be revealed, it would cause irreparable damage to him. The killer would have everything to lose if their secret were to be revealed. They were desperate and reckless. Desperate times call for desperate measures. And the suspects, as we have identified them, or as Chip has identified them: Stan Cutler, a millionaire with rapidly expanding business empires in the Far East; David Madison, a wealthy banker with banking contacts in Europe; Sheldon Haskins, a wealthy mobile in lots of financial difficulty; and Reed Harrison, in the midst of a multi-million-dollar divorce. So, according to Alex, our whiz kid here, he thinks that you should be thinking of the following questions in order to help you solve this mystery. Which of the suspects had managed to transfer most of his personal funds to an offshore account? Had also managed to transfer most of his assets to the accounts or the ownership of his 2 adult kids? Had been caught selling off some of their personal assets in order to pay off their debts? Had been discovered being investigated by the IRS? Which of the suspects could have been caught with incriminating text messages, with a list of incriminating cell phone calls, with incriminating emails? And based on all of this, which of them could have had the strongest motives for the crime? Could there have been more than one killer? Could the person who suggested the cover-up have been the killer, or maybe someone else? Could it have been a lone killer, or maybe an accomplice as well? Lots of questions to consider. Lots of suspects to consider. Wow. Well, let me just summarize again, so I don't want you to lose track of all of this and to keep everything focused. You have the description. You know what has gone on. No one was surprised to know later that the boardroom meeting had turned into a brawl. Most people, however, were quite surprised that the event had turned into a crime. Tensions had been high before the meeting, with the board members accusing each other of various white-collar crimes and misdeeds. Then someone had gone just a bit too far with their accusations. Things quickly got out of hand. The chairman could not control the resulting events, and an attempted cover-up suggested by someone had only made matters worse. Now it was too late to prevent the police from intervening, and they were at the crime scene. You know who the suspects are? And they are Stan Cutler, a millionaire with rapidly expanding business empires in the Far East; Davis Madison, a wealthy banker with lots of banking contacts in Europe; Sheldon Haskins, a wealthy mogul in lots of financial difficulty; and Reed Harrison, in the midst of a multi-million-dollar divorce. And you have to figure out which of the suspects had managed to transfer most of his personal funds to an offshore account. Which of the suspects had managed to transfer most of his assets to his adult kids? Which of the suspects had been caught selling off some of their personal assets in order to pay off their creditors? And which of the suspects had been discovered being investigated by the RIS? Which of the suspects could have been caught with incriminating text messages? Which of the suspects could have been caught with incriminating emails? And which of the suspects could have been caught with incriminating cell phone calls? Lots for you to think about. And based on all of this, which of them could have had the strongest motives for the crime? Could there have been more than one killer? Could the person who had suggested the cover-up have been the killer? Or maybe someone else? Could it have been a lone killer? Or could there have been an accomplice as well? Wow. Well, let's go on to the gathering of evidence, according to Dr. Ryan Martini. Forensics had reported that both victims had been shot with the same gun. Both victims had died from a single gunshot wound. But a third bullet had been found lodged in the wall behind the lectern. This bullet had come from a different gun, and this gun had not been found. There were no prints found on the gun that had been used to kill the investigators. A glove had later been found in a trash can on the second floor of the building. The glove had fitted the hands of two of the suspects and two of the three security guards. $100,000 had recently been transferred to the banking account of one of these guards. The other guard had also received a transfer of $100,000. Matching figures had also been discovered, having been transferred out of the accounts of one of the suspects. And a one-way ticket out of the country to a foreign country had also been found in the possession of another suspect. Emails, text messages, and lists of cell phone calls had been used to construct the facts about the suspects. Now, let's talk a little bit more about each of these suspects. See if we can unravel this mystery for you. Let's look first at Stan Cutler. He was a millionaire with rapidly expanding business empires in Asia. He had managed to transfer most of his personal funds to an offshore account. But Stan was also in deep financial troubles, and he had needed money to pay off loans and creditors as well. And this was all due to his rapidly expanding business empires. And he had been determined to protect his own personal financial assets. But along the way, he had also engaged in some very shady deals. He was known best as a business tycoon, but he was also known to be quite ruthless at times, and he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. He had been a board member of the bank for over 15 years now. That was the profile of Stan Cutler. Next, we should look at Reed Harrison. Reed was in the midst of a multi-million-dollar divorce. He had managed to transfer most of his assets to the names of his adult kids. Reed was being sued by his high-flying socialite wife because, as always, he had been caught cheating on her. He had managed to convince his kids to go against their mom, and he and his kids had moved out of the family's multi-million-dollar mansion into a luxurious condo. His creditors were now after him for payment, and he needed money to keep his creditors at bay. He had recently transferred sums of $100,000 to various accounts. He had been a well-known banker, and he had been a board member for the past 10 years. That was what we found out about Reed Harrison. Next, David Madison. He was a wealthy banker with banking contacts in Europe. And he had been caught selling off some of his personal assets in order to pay off creditors. Another one of those. He was also being investigated for other wrongdoings by the IRS. And he had been a well-known international banker. He had recently moved his family out of the country to Panama, and he had recently transferred sums of $100,000 to 2 separate accounts. And he was presently living in an exclusive condo complex. And he was well known for helping to cover up cover-ups. He had been a board member for the last 8 years. That was the profile of this suspect, David Madison. Finally, Sheldon Haskins. He was a wealthy mogul in lots of financial difficulty. It had been discovered that he was being investigated by the RIS. He had been accused of insider trading on behalf of other well-known companies. He had been recently found guilty of tax evasion in the sum of millions of dollars, and he had been well known for his ability to transfer funds, leaving little trace for others to find. Sheldon was a highly paid electronics funds transfer specialist and expert. And he was also known for his ability to find loopholes in the system. And he too had been a board member for the last 8 years. That was our Sheldon Haskins. 4 suspects with lots of questionable motives. Who really did it? Let's turn now to another facet of this mystery. And let's try to look through the eyes of the killer according to our young Alex Kirchhoff. The killer knew that he had to kill both of the investigators in order to stop the investigation and give enough time for a getaway. When the investigators presented their information, pointing their finger at the primary source of the embezzlement, and after the question of an attempted cover-up seemed unlikely, the killer knew that they had to make their move. They started the brawl and waited for the right moment to strike. They did it cleanly and then used the mayhem to get rid of the gun and the glove. They had counted on a brawl taking place before they fired their gun, and they counted on a mayhem following. They used the glove as part of their mode of operation. Well, let's go on to the arrest and tell you what happened here. It was a typical winter's day when the cops came for the suspect. Yes, Christmas was definitely in the air for many, but not for these cops as they moved in, crunching freshly fallen snow under their feet as they walked. They wore thick gloves and stamped their boots to brush off the snow. Just before they entered the building, they made sure that their boots were clean and that their gloves were free of snow. The arrest had taken place about a week after the crime had taken place. The suspect was arrested at his luxurious condo while having supper with some friends. He did not resist the arrest. It was hard to tell whether or not he was surprised. The same for his friends. Well, we're going to go to court now. But before we do that, can you guess who was arrested? If you look at where the arrest took place, it then could either have been Reed Harrison or David Madison. Because Reed had recently moved into a luxurious condo, and David had also recently moved into an exclusive condo complex. It could be assumed that David was the one who had been found with the one-way ticket out of the country, given that he had recently moved his family to Panama. Yet, both Reed and David had recently transferred sums of $100,000 to 2 separate accounts. Who was it? Let's go to court now and see what happens, okay? It was a packed courtroom that was made up of banking fraternity and international media on that particular day, and the prosecution charged the following: first-degree murder based on a premeditated act with the intent to kill. David Madison was charged with the first-degree murders of Robin Benson and Amanda Stokes. And they were the 2 investigators, as you remember, who had been hired by the bank. The prosecution presented the following case. The accused had planned the murders beforehand. First, he moved his family to Panama. Next, he purchased a one-way ticket out of the country. Then he made the funds transfers. He knew exactly what he was going to do on the meeting on that day. He had waited to see what the investigators had to say. Then, when he was certain that the finger had been pointed at him, he made his move. First, he started the brawl himself. Then he had proposed a cover-up. And then when the cover-up had gone wrong, he had shot both investigators. Then he had used the mayhem to slip out of the boardroom. And he had thrown the gun down onto the main floor and had disposed of the glove on a trash can or in a trash can on the second floor. The prosecution had submitted that David would have had enough time to have disposed of both gun and glove while the mayhem was taking place. He was quick enough to have done all of this and then slipped back into the room before the police had arrived. The prosecution had also claimed that the accused had been helped by at least one of the guards, if not by both, given that the accused had recently transferred two sums of $100,000 each to two separate accounts. However, the prosecution, with all of this, could not produce conclusive evidence that the transfer had come from David's accounts. The defense submitted that the suspect could have not have had enough time to do what he had been accused of before the police had arrived. They also tried to raise the question of the third shot having been fired. Who had fired it and why? Remember now, a third bullet had been found lodged in the wall at the back of the lectern and had come from a different gun. How could the accused have known about a trash can being located on the third floor, is what the defense was asking? Who really fired the gun? Did anyone see the accused leave the room? Could either of those two guards have fired the fatal shots? Why was the prosecution unable to prove, without a doubt, that the funds transfers had come from David's account? And why were they not able to prove that they had come from those accounts and into the accounts of the guards? Very, very interesting questions. Questions that raise a lot of doubt. Now, in the minds of the jury, could David have had enough time to do what the prosecution had been claiming? How could the firing of the third shot have figured in this equation? Should the question of the funds transfers be given any credence? Could David have been helped by either or both of the two guards? Lots of questions. Wonder if we're going to get answers. Well, outside the court, the general opinion was as follows. There was not enough evidence to convict David. He could not have had enough time to do what the prosecution was claiming. There was not enough evidence to prove that he had made the funds transfers. There was no other evidence to prove that there was a link between David and the security guards. Well, we took a straw poll of those outside the courtroom and those willing to talk to us. Guilty or not guilty? Not enough evidence? enough time to have committed the crime? Well, it was sort of split, but I would say that it leaned towards David not being guilty. And David was indeed found not guilty through insufficient evidence. Right? Now, who do you think really did it? Before I tell you, take just a few seconds to think about it. Who did it? Well, I'll tell you, the real killer was Sheldon Haskins. He had used his skills as an electronic funds transfer specialist and expert to transfer the funds to the accounts of the 2 security guards. Remember now, it had previously been stated that he had had the skills to transfer funds without leaving a trace of his activities. He knew how to find loopholes as well. He was also known as a very highly paid electronics funds transfer specialist. He had made a very careful plan, and he had bribed 2 of the 3 guards with his money to perform 2 specific tasks. Each had worn a glove on their right hand. When the investigators had gone into the room and had gotten to the stage of pointing the finger at who they thought were the perpetrators of the embezzlement, Sheldon had begun to shout and throw accusations. This had led to a war of words, as which was sure would happen. Then he had attempted to bring about a cover-up that he knew would not go anywhere. And when he was sure that it was not going anywhere, he had given his signals to the guards. Words that he had shouted and had told the guards to listen for. "This is over," is what he had shouted. That was a signal to the guards. The first guard had fired a deliberate shot at the wall behind the lectern. And then when mayhem had broken out, the second guard that had sprung into action. He had killed both investigators and then had slipped away to throw the gun down onto the main floor. And the first guard pretended he had been pretending to be trying to control the mayhem, and had distracted the third guard as the second guard had slipped away. But when the third guard was on the phone calling the police, the second guard had by then returned and had distracted the third guard, as the first guard had snuck down to the second floor and had disposed of the glove. His gun had never been found. Kind of confusing, but what it is that Sheldon Haskins had hired these 2 guards to do his dirty work. It was quite an intricate plan on the part of Sheldon Haskins. He had used his money to bribe the guards to carry out his plans. The plan had indeed worked, and Mr. Haskins had not been caught for a very long time, until one night when one of the guards spilled the beans. He had been drinking at a bar. He had told one friend, who had told another friend, who had told another friend, and finally it had reached the ears of the police. Mr. Haskins was arrested along with the 2 security guards. One guard had been convicted of first-degree murder, and Mr. Haskins and the other guard were convicted as accomplices. A very, very intricate plan indeed. Mr. Haskins knew what he was doing. He bribed the 2 guards. One guard had fired that shot, distracting the room. And while mayhem was going on, the second guard did what he was paid to do. First guard distracted the third guard, and on it went. But in the end, the murderer was caught, and Haskins was put behind bars. That's it for me for this show. My name is Detective DJ. I hope you enjoyed listening to this show. I encourage you to keep on listening, and you have a great day.